Let's take a look at the Revit adoption lifecycle, how the usage of different versions of Revit changes over time. I have anonymized data of users of our product, ElectroBIM, which is an electrical add-in for Revit. All these users are electrical engineers. Their version of Revit is going to be driven by the architect that they're working with. These numbers are going to be a pretty good representation of how Revit is being used in the industry at a point in time. For each month, I counted up the number of people who ran a command in a specific version of Revit and divided it by the total number of people who use any commands in our software. That gives us, for each version of Revit, the percentage of people who are using Revit who are using that version. When we're looking at the graphs, the percentage of users of each version each month is going to be more than 100% because most people are working in projects in more than one version of Revit. Let's start by taking a look at these numbers over time, starting in January of 2023. Let's start by putting Revit 2020 on the graph. That's the oldest version of Revit I have data for. At this point, it's been out for 3.5 years, and you can see that usage is pretty low and it's falling over time. That's to be expected, but at the end of this graph, after 6 years, there are still some projects that are being finished up in Revit 2020. Next, we can add Revit 2021. It's been out for 2.5 years at this point, and you can see that it's following a very similar pattern. Not a whole lot of people using it, and that number falling over time. Let's add Revit 2022. Oh, that number's a little bit different. You can see that it's been out for 1.5 years at this point. It has what is its peak popularity and falls off from here. Now we can add Revit 2023. It's been out for less than a year at this point, so its usage is increasing, and you can see that it peaks about a year later, same as Revit 2022 did the year before, and then it starts falling off. For Revit 2024, we can see the start of the graph. It's released later in 2023, and you can see that obviously the usage starts very low as people start incorporating it into their projects, and it increases over time. It is just now hitting its peak popularity. Revit 2025 has a similar curve. It's released a year later, and it's been slowly adopted over the last year. Finally, we can throw Revit 2026 on there. We only have 2 months of data, so there's not a whole lot interesting to see. That graph was looking at the adoption of each version of Revit at a specific point in time. Let's flip that graph just a little bit, and let's look at the adoption of each version of Revit since it was released. So now instead of a specific month on the x-axis, we have months since release. We can again start with Revit 2020, and since we only have data from 2023, we have the tail end of its life cycle, and you can see that its usage is obviously falling off. Next, let's add Revit 2021. You can again see a similar falling off, but you can actually start to compare the versions of Revit at this point and see that Revit 2020 is actually a slightly more popular version than Revit 2021 at its similar point in its life cycle. Now we add Revit 2022. You can see that 2 years after release, it's very, very popular, and then it starts falling off. And it's falling off, and it's kind of starting to match the Revit 2020 curve at the end. Next, we add Revit 2023. You can see the rise and fall of the popularity, again, peaking about 2 years, but it wasn't as popular as Revit 2022 was at its peak. Then we add Revit 2024, the first version where we have month 0 data, and we can see the full curve of Revit 2024 so far. Comparing it to Revit 2023, you can see that it appears to be a little bit more popular. Then we can add Revit 2025. Again, we have a little over a year of data on this version. Doesn't appear to be as popular as Revit 2024 was. And again, for completeness, let's throw Revit 2026 on there. We've only got 2 months of data, not a whole lot to see here. This graph demonstrates what I think we all kind of intuitively know about Revit. Obviously, you don't install it on release day. You're not converting your projects immediately, but as time goes on, you start converting projects or starting projects on that new version of Revit. After about 2 years, that's the peak usage of that version of Revit, and then it starts falling off from there. I'm not sure how actionable any of this data is. You can at least use it to benchmark where your project is in comparison to what other people are doing. If you are using the most recent version of Revit on any of your projects, you're early. Anytime in that first 12 months, you can consider yourself an early adopter of that version of Revit. Once a version of Revit has been out for a year, it's starting to become the typical or standard project version. So the version of Revit that's previous and two previous from the most recent version, those are kind of typical project versions. So that's where most projects are going to be living. And then anything 3 versions back or older, you can consider that an old project in terms of Revit versions. I don't think there's any particular harm in using those older versions of Revit. Generally, for the electrical engineers that I typically speak to, their version of Revit's being driven by the architect for the architects, they have to decide if they want to upgrade those old versions of Revit to the newer version of not, if it's worth converting your projects. As you can see, there are plenty of people who are finishing projects on versions of Revit that are 4, 5, and 6 years old.